Thanks for staying with us. Electricity Minister Kgosientso Ramokgopa said they proposed a plan to create about 12,000 megawatts of additional electricity capacity on a short-term basis. However, South Africa should brace itself for a tough winter since the minister is not promising any reprieve. Let's now speak to Hohm Energy Head of Business Intelligence, Matthew Cruz, who joins us live now. Matthew, thank you so much for your time this evening. The minister, of course, talking about how, the outlook for winter may not be as, as improved as some were hoping to be. But just a little earlier on, we had a story here on the show where Eskom says that it does not expect rolling blackouts to go beyond stage 6 in winter. Your thoughts on that?
So I would say that that is a bit of wishful thinking on behalf of Eskom, unfortunately. As things stand at the moment, if we have our current level of generation continue to be what it is now, as we're going into winter, we'll actually hit stage 11. So they're planning on certain generating units coming back from maintenance during this time, and they're kind of banking on that we'll have a bit more generation available during winter than we had during the summer months. But I would say, given the history of those generating units getting put back onto service from maintenance and the way that things typically go in Eskom, that we see often them communicating wishful thinking that we won't hit more than stage 6 load shedding. Our projections are that we'll hit stage 8 load shedding as a minimum peak. We could actually see us going up to stage 11, one hopes not. But I definitely do see stage 8 happening before the end of the year and over the winter time as well.
What would stage 11 mean?
So stage 11, if we look at the stages, stage 6 means, but depending on your location and region, you are without power between 10 to 12 hours a day. Stage 8 means that you're without power between 12 and 14 hours per day, depending on your municipality and your region. And then stage 11 adds 3 hours to that. So then you're without power between 13 and 17 hours per day. And that's more like you look for when you're going to have power for those brief periods you do, rather than when you're not going to have power.
And, listening to the minister over the weekend, he talks about adding more, power to the grid. There's talk of the return of 3 units at Kusile by the end of the year. He says Medupi Unit 4 expected to give us around 700 megawatts by February. He says, now, just practical, how practical are these time frames given the instability of the grid?
So the time frames are practical for when they are going to come back online. It's difficult to get real insights in terms of how the maintenance is currently happening and whether they'll actually meet the dates or not from the outside. People on the inside tend to know that information. But what I can say is that the first time that any of those units are planning to come back is August. And that's already now after the peak of winter. So we don't see new generation coming back to the grid in that sense until August. So given our current generation capacity, we do have a significant shortfall that will only increase as the winter demand increases as well. So I can also give insights from my time in Medupi and Kusile that when units come back from long-term maintenance or long-term repairs like that, we typically don't see the unit performing very well. This is mainly because while the unit is down and offline for repairs, the parts that are used, the parts of the unit are used elsewhere. It's called cannibalization of the generating unit, where they take a fan from here, take a mill bearing from there, and they use it to keep the current units generating and with parts. And then when we bring a unit back from maintenance or repairs, it typically performs even worse than before it went offline. So I wouldn't bank that when those units come back online that they'll actually be functioning at 100% capacity as expected.
And could the opening of bid window 7 next month help?
So yeah, this bid window story, it's a very difficult place that the ANC finds himself in. And to explain that, last year we heard from Cyril Ramaphosa in July that he will be doubling the bid window capacity for bid window 6 from 2,600 megawatts to 5,200 megawatts. And this was a part of the emergency crisis response plan of the emergency crisis of the electricity issue that we find ourselves in. So that was one of the big things that was going to bring additional capacity. And only a few short months later, 6 months later, we hear actually bid window 6 failed, in that there is no capacity for wind generating power to come onto the grid that's going to be placed in the south of the country for providing the north of the country electricity. So in terms of the 5,200 megawatts that was planned, that we expanded the bid window and opened it up, it now is looking like we're only going to get 1,300 megawatts onto the grid from that stage. And so that's now looking at stage at bid window 6. A failure of half, so from 2,600 to 1,300. Now we see bid window 7 coming, and the timelines for when that actually would have power coming onto the grid is like 2 to 3 years. If everything goes well and all the projects are able to reach financial close, which is also something that affected stage 6 and stage 5. So I don't see just opening up another bid window as a solution to the problem. I see more opening up of the energy sector and the energy market to a democratized state, which was envisioned in 1998 already, of going away from this monopoly model that Eskom has over the sector and going towards a developed country model where you have different energy providers bidding to put power onto the grid. That's what we actually need to see. I don't actually see stage 7 or bid window 7 making a big difference from my perspective.
So not even the minister saying that, they're looking at areas where there's greater capacity when it comes to this bid window is enough to convince you that we may see some movement there?
So when he's talking about that, that's off of learnings from looking at the Northern Cape, which is now at full capacity, that you can no longer take solar energy onto the grid in the Northern Cape. They'll need to produce, they'll need to construct new power lines that take between 5 to 8 years to construct in order to get additional capacity from the Northern Cape with the solar assets that are there. So he's talking more about places that already have a good arterial that can take on thousands of megawatts onto the grid at that point. So places like Mpumalanga as a primary example of a really good place. The power station that I started my career in, Komati Power Station, has already undergone this kind of process where they've now decommissioned the coal units and they're putting on now solar and wind and battery. My perspective, though, regarding this is that solar farms and wind farms will not actually solve the load shedding that we're seeing in the evenings and the mornings, which is when we have this most severe load shedding, because that's when our evening peak happens. The peak demand happens in the evening when people are trying to cook and heat up their houses during winter and the geysers are on. So in terms of 7 p.m. peak, that is when the peak demand is in the country. And in winter, it's about 3,000 or 35,000 megawatts to 32,000 megawatts. In summer, it's less, it's 28,000 megawatts to 30,000 megawatts. But in terms of providing power at nights, I think we can all understand that solar farms do not give you energy at 7 p.m. That energy would need to be stored first in batteries and then to be delivered onto the grid. And everyone focuses on the solar farm being so cheap. It's like 40 cents per kilowatt hour. But they don't say, well, that's only when the sun's shining in the middle of the day. If you pair it with batteries, it costs about 10 times more in terms of what you're actually delivering in kilowatt hours at 7 p.m. And it goes the same for wind. Wind typically blows more in the middle of the night. It's not typically blowing in the evenings at the peak demand or the morning demand. And on average, you only have about 20% capacity of your wind farm actually producing power over a week or over a month. So we can't rely, in my opinion, on large-scale solar and wind farms without battery storage or hydro storage to provide you power in the evening peak demand of 7 p.m. So we have to keep on that in mind. How are we going to get electricity onto our grid to meet the peak demand in the evenings when the people of South Africa really need electricity to heat up their houses and to cook?
And there's something else, just before I let you go, that I'd like us to talk about is what the minister talks about, that they're going to be starting this week, in fact, and that is an assessment of national key points to see whether or not there are emergency solutions that are required here to assist with the issue of rolling blackouts. Is this a good move in your view?
So I do like the move because there are interesting, innovative options that can be used, apart from just saying that a whole region or a whole neighborhood should not be included in load shedding because it includes a police station or water processing plant or hospital, and then further making things worse and almost then having a situation where if we had to go down that route of just exempting the neighborhoods, then you almost have like half the country being exempt because the regions, the substation that feeds the region is feeding such a big neighborhood. We don't want to have a situation where we have only half the nation getting power because they're near a hospital or they're near a water processing plant, and then the other half now has to pay for that. The innovative solutions that can come from this kind of conversation, however, which I'm really excited about, is what if you put down solar and battery installations on the actual facilities themselves that are government owned? And wind is a potential, but solar paired with battery has been found to be the best option for helping a facility go off-grid or become grid adjacent. So not necessarily disconnecting their need from the grid, but being able to take care of 80 to 90% of their own power needs with a solar and battery installation, then maybe a diesel generator added in as well. Whereas before, those facilities wouldn't have the mandates to be able to go out and buy a generator or buy solar panels and batteries because they were restricted from spending money on those kinds of assets. So I actually do see this as a benefit because it could result in the infrastructure taking care of its own energy needs locally, which is where I really see the solution happening.
Thank you very much for your thoughts, Matthew. Do appreciate him. That was Matthew Cruz, who is Home Energy Head of Business.